I always knew the HOA was a problem. I saw it in the way my neighbors spoke in hushed voices, in the frustration on their faces when they received yet another violation notice for something as trivial as the color of their mailbox. But me, I stayed out of it, not because I was afraid, far from it, but because I knew that if they ever came after me, they would be making the biggest mistake of their lives. My house was my sanctuary, tucked away at the edge of the neighborhood, surrounded by towering trees that had stood for generations. It was a piece of history that I intended to preserve. The trees weren't just trees, they were a living barrier, a symbol of privacy, a natural wall between me and the world. I had made it clear when I bought the property, I wanted no interference from the HOA. I paid in cash, no financing, no contracts, nothing that legally bound me to their absurd rules. That didn't stop her from trying. Margaret Hastings, HOA president, self-appointed queen of the neighborhood. A woman who wielded power not through reason or fairness, but through intimidation and bureaucracy. From the moment I moved in, she made it her mission to integrate me into her perfect vision of the community. First, there were the polite letters suggesting that my trees were out of sync with the neighborhood aesthetic. Then came the official violation notices, each more ridiculous than the last. I ignored them all. And then, one evening, I came home and felt my stomach drop. Something was wrong. At first, I couldn't quite place it. My driveway was clear, my house untouched, but then the smell hit me, freshly cut wood, the scent of destruction. I turned my head and my heart stopped. My trees were gone, all of them. Not trimmed, not pruned, gone. Where there had once been a lush green canopy, now stood an empty wasteland of torn-up earth and jagged stumps. The towering giants that had shaded my home, the same trees that had stood long before Margaret Hastings ever set foot in this neighborhood, had been cut down without warning. The world around me seemed to slow, the blood in my veins turned ice cold. And then I saw it. A truck parked brazenly in front of my house, its side emblazoned with the HOA logo, a war trophy displayed for all to see. And standing next to it, arms crossed, with a smug little smile on her lips, was Margaret Hastings. She was waiting for me. "Ah, I'm so glad you're here," she said, feigning sympathy. "We were just making some necessary adjustments. Your trees didn't meet community standards." She expected outrage. She wanted me to lose control, to yell, to curse, to give her a reason to play the victim. Instead, I smiled, a slow, calculated smile, because Margaret Hastings had no idea who she had just picked a fight with. And she was about to learn what happens when you break the law in front of the wrong person. I stood there staring at the devastation, trying to process what I was seeing. The destruction was absolute. The towering trees that had once enclosed my property in a private green sanctuary were nothing more than splintered stumps and scattered debris. The ground, once shaded and cool, was now a barren battlefield, the air thick with the scent of fresh-cut wood. It wasn't an accident. It wasn't a mistake. This was a message. And Margaret Hastings, standing by her HOA-marked truck, wanted to make sure I received it loud and clear. "We had to do it," she said, her voice dripping with forced sympathy. "Your trees were disrupting the uniform aesthetic of the neighborhood. This is about maintaining harmony." Harmony, that word, always used by people who want to control everything around them. I exhaled slowly, forcing myself to stay calm. She wanted an outburst. She wanted me to lose control, to yell, to make a scene, so she could paint me as the problem. Instead, I nodded. "Let me get this straight," I said, keeping my voice even. "You trespassed onto my property, destroyed my trees, without my permission." Margaret's smile faltered for just a second before she recovered. "Not quite," she said, lifting her chin. "The HOA has authority over community aesthetics, and your trees, well, they were out of compliance. This was within our rights." I tilted my head slightly as if considering her words. "Good," I said simply. Her eyebrows pulled together. "Good?" "Yes," I continued, my voice casual, "because now I get to take this to court." The shift in her demeanor was immediate, the smug confidence drained from her face, replaced with something else. Confusion, suspicion. She let out a short, nervous laugh. "There's no need to escalate this. It was a simple decision by the HOA. I took a step closer, my voice low, deliberate. "I'm a federal judge." Silence. Her breath hitched. Her arms, once folded in arrogance, now dropped slightly at her sides. She opened her mouth to speak, but nothing came out. "You committed trespassing," I continued. "Destroyed private property without authorization. This This isn't just an HOA violation, Margaret. This is a crime." I watched as the full weight of my words settled over her. She had spent years bullying homeowners into submission, weaponizing HOA rules to exert control over the neighborhood. She had never expected real consequences. Never imagined that she'd crossed the wrong person. But she had. And now she was going to pay for it. I turned without another word and walked into my house, because I already knew exactly what was going to happen next. I wasn't just going to fight Margaret Hastings. I was going to destroy her. I sat at my desk, my hands steady as I began to build my case. This wasn't about revenge. This was about justice. Margaret Hastings had played her little power games with the wrong person, and now she was about to learn what happens when you break the law in front of someone who knows exactly how to make you pay for it. The first step was evidence. I pulled up the security camera footage. Every second of it was crystal clear. The HOA trucks rolling onto my property, workers stepping out with chainsaws, the brutal destruction of my trees, Margaret herself standing at the scene, supervising the operation like a dictator, overseeing her conquests. Perfect. Next came the law. I knew my rights, but I needed to confirm just how deep her mistake went. A little research into the city's zoning laws and public records told me what I already suspected. My property was not legally under HOA jurisdiction. In other words, they had no legal authority to touch anything on my land. That alone was enough to bury them. But I wasn't done. I dug deeper. Where does the HOA's money go? HOAs have strict rules about how they're supposed to use the fees collected from residents, maintenance, community projects, security, but I knew many of them operate in the shadows, funneling money into questionable expenses. It didn't take long to find what I was looking for. Massive payments to landscaping companies that didn't exist, suspicious bank transfers to personal accounts, inflated fees with no explanations. Margaret Hastings wasn't just running a dictatorship. She was running a scam. The deeper I look, the uglier it got. Thousands of dollars vanishing with no record of where they went, financial reports filled with discrepancies, HOA funds being bled dry while residents were forced to pay higher fees every year. She thought she was untouchable. She thought no one would dare question her authority. She was dead wrong. But before I tore the HOA apart legally, I wanted to see how they would react, test the waters. So I waited. Days passed. Margaret didn't show her face near my house, but I received a letter from the HOA, a pathetic attempt at damage control. It was a carefully worded excuse, claiming the trees were aged and had been removed for safety reasons. They regretted the misunderstanding and hoped there were no hard feelings. And then, at the very end of the letter, the real kicker, a warning that I could be fined if I attempted to plant new trees without HOA approval. I almost laughed. They still thought they were in control. That letter would look beautiful as evidence in court. But before I filed my lawsuit, I had one last move to make. I was about to turn the entire neighborhood against Margaret Hastings. And when I was done, she wouldn't just lose her power, she would lose everything. Margaret Hastings had spent years ruling the neighborhood with an iron fist, crushing anyone who dared to defy her. She thought she was invincible. She thought no one would challenge her authority. She was about to learn just how wrong she was. The evidence I had gathered was damning. The illegal destruction of my trees, the blatant trespassing, the financial corruption within the HOA. But taking Margaret down wasn't just about winning in court. I wanted her to lose everything, the power, the control, and the blind loyalty of the people she had manipulated for so long. And to do that, I needed the neighborhood to see the truth for themselves. The gathering. One evening, I invited a few trusted neighbors over for a friendly chat. These weren't just random residents. They were the ones who had already shown frustration with the HOA, the ones who had been fined for ridiculous infractions, the ones who whispered complaints but never dared to say them out loud. When they arrived, I didn't waste time. I placed the financial reports on the table, the fraudulent transactions, the money that had disappeared into thin air. Then I pulled up the security footage on my screen, the HOA trucks, the workers with chainsaws, the destruction of my trees under Margaret's supervision. Silence filled the room as my neighbors processed what they were seeing. Then someone finally spoke. "That explains why they keep raising our fees," one man muttered, his face pale, "and why the HOA never has money for anything." "They charge us for community maintenance," a woman added, shaking her head, "but half the streetlights haven't worked in months. Where the hell is all our money going?" Another man clenched his fists. "They fined me $200 for having a flower pot on my porch. A flower pot. Meanwhile, Margaret's been stealing from us this entire time?" The anger in the room was palpable. The frustration that had simmered beneath the surface for years was finally boiling over. Margaret had controlled these people through fear, through intimidation, but now they weren't afraid anymore. They were furious. Word spread like wildfire. The next day, people started talking. Conversations that used to be about weather and weekend plans were now about HOA fraud and corruption. Groups of neighbors gathered outside, whispering, shaking their heads, staring toward Margaret's house with newfound resentment. And Margaret, for the first time since I had moved in, she wasn't parading around the neighborhood like she owned it. She stayed inside, avoiding eye contact, avoiding the growing storm. But her problems were only just beginning. That evening, a group of homeowners stormed the HOA office demanding answers. They wanted to see the books to understand why their money had been disappearing. Margaret refused to meet them, sending out a pathetic email instead. Some nonsense about mismanagement and clerical errors. No one bought it. The rebellion had begun. The breaking point. 3 days later, Margaret finally showed up, but she wasn't smiling anymore. She called for an emergency HOA meeting, hoping to contain the damage before it spiraled out of control. She thought she could smooth things over with a few well-rehearsed lies. She thought wrong, because I was going to be there, and I wasn't coming empty-handed. Margaret Hastings had spent years ruling this neighborhood through fear, but fear only works when people feel powerless. And now, she was the one who had everything to lose. Margaret thought she could contain the damage. She called for an emergency HOA meeting, hoping to regain control, to weave a web of lies convincing enough to keep the neighborhood in check. She had spent years manipulating these people, bending them to her will with fines, intimidation, and bureaucratic nonsense. But that was before they saw the truth. The community center was packed. Residents stood shoulder to shoulder, arms crossed, faces tight with anger. The air was thick with tension, a storm ready to break. Margaret sat at the front, her usual air of superiority faltering as she shuffled her notes with trembling hands. She tried to start with excuses. "There have been some misunderstandings," she said, forcing a tight smile. "A few accounting errors, nothing to be concerned about. I assure you, the HOA's finances are in order." The murmurs of discontent began. Then she tried deflecting blame. "The trees, well, they were a safety hazard," she said, glancing at me. "We had to act in the best interest of the community. The crowd wasn't buying it. And that's when I stood up. The room went silent. I walked to the front, placing a thick folder of documents on the table beside her. I could feel Margaret's eyes on me, her breath catching in her throat. "You want to talk about the HOA's finances?" I said. "Fine, let's talk about them." I opened the folder, pulling out page after page of damning evidence. Here are all the suspicious transactions from the past 2 years. Tens of thousands of dollars in unexplained expenses, payments to companies that don't exist, transfers to personal accounts, all approved by you. Margaret's face turned white. The room erupted, residents demanding explanations, their voices rising, accusations flying. I let the chaos settle for a moment before dropping the next bombshell. "And while we're on the topic of illegal activity," I continued, pulling out another document, "this is the official report from the city's environmental agency. You had no legal authority to remove my trees. That means the HOA is now facing tens of thousands of dollars in fines for unlawful destruction of private property." Margaret's hands clenched into fists, but she couldn't say a word. Then, right on cue, her phone rang. She hesitated before answering, but the second she did, I watched the blood drain from her face. It didn't take long for everyone else to realize what was happening. The health accounts had been frozen. The government had officially launched an investigation. A lawsuit was already in motion. Margaret had just lost everything. She fumbled to speak, to salvage what little dignity she had left, but no one was listening anymore. The residents had turned on her completely. By the end of the night, the decision was made. The HOA was dissolved. Margaret disappeared soon after, sold her house, packed her bags, and fled the neighborhood she once ruled like a queen. And me? I stayed exactly where I was. Because I hadn't just won. I had buried her. Margaret Hastings was gone. The woman who had ruled this neighborhood with an iron grip, who had bullied, intimidated, and stolen from the very people she was supposed to serve, had vanished overnight. Her house went up for sale almost immediately. The listing appearing online before the dust from the HOA's collapse had even settled. Rumors spread. Some said she moved across the country to escape the humiliation. Others whispered that she was facing more than just financial ruin, that there were legal consequences looming in the background. Honestly, I didn't care where she went. She was finished. With the HOA dismantled, the neighborhood finally breathed again. The constant fines, the arbitrary rules, the fear of stepping out of line, gone. The residents came together, forming a new community council. Not an oppressive, power-hungry organization like before, but an actual democratic system where every homeowner had a voice. And me? I could have left. I could have sold my house, moved somewhere else, started fresh. But I stayed, not out of spite, not to gloat over Margaret's downfall, but because this was my home, and now, for the first time since I moved in, it finally felt like one. Justice, not revenge. One afternoon I stood in my yard, staring at the empty space where my trees had once stood. The destruction was still there, raw, ugly, irreversible. But I didn't feel anger, because in their place, something greater had grown. Just as Margaret had wanted to teach me a lesson, to bend me to her will. Instead, she had taught the entire neighborhood why people like her should never be allowed to have power. I had won. And I hadn't needed to raise my voice, hadn't needed to throw a punch, hadn't needed to sink to her level. All I had done was used the law against someone who thought she was above it. The future. Weeks later, neighbors I barely knew before stopped to talk to me in the street. They thanked me. Some even offered to help replant my trees. And as I watched fresh saplings take root where the old giants had once stood, I knew one thing for certain. Well, this wasn't just about trees. This was about taking back what was ours, and making sure no one ever took it away again,